Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Great, thank you. It looks like people who need to be here are in the room, so we'll get started. Welcome to day 8 of the hearing for the Victoria Murray Floodplain Restoration Project relating to the EES Central package. As everybody knows, the hearing is being recorded. My name is Lisa Kendall and I'm chair of the committee considering the EES Central package, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Member Kirsch as Deputy Chair, Member Bell and Member Ham, so you can see those committee members on the screen. Today we'll be hearing submissions from Environment Victoria and this afternoon from Friends of VMFRP Park. So I'll just ask if those parties can be given presenter status. It looks as though Environment Victoria already have, sitting at the top of the screen there. So hopefully that will all work well. And this afternoon I ask if the representative of VMFRP Park could also be given presenter status. Only one minor timetable matter relates to the Fenner School of Environment, who are scheduled tomorrow morning for 30 minutes. They've requested the potential extension for up to 10 minutes to allow for questions from the committee if required. So I'll just note that we do have a slightly longer morning tea break scheduled tomorrow morning, so that time can easily be accommodated. It may mean that the next submitter, Donald McLeod, starts a few minutes later than scheduled, but once we get to our morning tea break, we will be back on track. So there's no issue from the committee's perspective accommodating that. Thank you, Professor Piddock. I can see that you have your thumbs up acknowledging that. We will let Mr. McLeod know that we might be running behind time, but that he should be here either way. I'll just run through the documents received over the last couple of days. So the email from the committee to parties withdrawing table document 134 and with an update on the site visit is document 155. The Environment Victoria hearing submission is document 156. And with 2 annexures, both which are numbered document 157 and 158. Peter Kelly's hearing submission is 159 and the Fenner School of Environment's presentation is 160. So there's no further preliminary matters from the committee's perspective. I'll just come to the proponent to see if there's anything we need to cover this morning.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend, and I'll just ask if other parties, if there are any other preliminary matters we need to discuss. No, it looks like we're good to keep moving then, which is fantastic. Welcome to Ms. Maybury from representing Environment Victoria. And I might just get you when you do your introduction. I'm assuming that you'll be the one doing the presentation, but if there's something that you need to explain to us, please do. I'm happy to hand directly to you for your submissions, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm happy to speak to that in my introductory remarks. And thank you to the committee as well for hearing us today. And before we begin, I'll acknowledge that we're joining from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country this morning, and I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of country and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge that we'll be speaking about the traditional country of other traditional owners in Victoria today. To the point you just raised, Chair, I'm joined by my colleague, Ms. Hogan, and we're appearing on behalf of Environment Victoria. We have 3 key points that we propose to take the committee to today, which are based on the written submission that was tabled as document 156. I'll be speaking to the first 2 of those sections and Ms. Hogan will speak to the third. And we'll then be in the committee's hands for questions, and I'm happy to handle those between ourselves or as the committee prefers at that point in time. So as I said, we'll be speaking to table document 156 and also making reference to 2 documents that we tabled, which you've mentioned this morning, documents 157 and 158. those being the Murray-Darling Basin Royal Commission report and the Advancing the Treaty Process with Aboriginal Victorians Act of 2018, which we'll refer to as the Treaty Act, two documents that we weren't aware were before the committee, but we considered important. From the timetable, we've been allocated 2 hours to speak. We expect that it shouldn't take us more than the section before the break to talk through our submission, and then we can receive any questions that the committee may have, so it may not take us the full 2 hours.
Thank you, Ms. Maybe. Could I, apologies, I'll just interrupt at that point, just to note that if that is the case and if the committee, if we don't need the entire 2 hour allocation, the committee's preference would be for a continuing timetable. So for the next party, the Friends of Niagara Vinifera, to be ready to present early if they are able to or available to do that. So I'll just make that comment now. You don't, the representatives of Niagara Vinifera do not need to let me know now. I will come to you at that point to confirm, but if possible, that would be the committee's preference. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. As I've mentioned, our submission is divided into 3 parts. I will first speak to the project context and to traditional owner rights, and then Ms. Hogan will speak to deficiencies in the EES. We'll use the term the projects throughout to refer to both Adder Lakes North and Belsa-Yungara projects. And I'll begin now by taking you to document 156, and I'll be commencing on the first page of that document to speak through some of the key points that we make there. As we've mentioned there, we are appearing on behalf of Environment Victoria, a Victorian incorporated association formed following the success of a group of people who came to protect an area of land in Western Victoria and the Little Desert National Park. Environment Victoria's purpose is to bring about a sustainable society living in a healthy environment, and Environment Victoria has campaigned for years in relation to the Murray-Darling Basin and the health of the rivers. We would start by saying that we, in this process and in the documentation, haven't seen disagreement amongst parties about the fact that action is needed to halt and reverse the severe ecological decline of the Murray River floodplains, a situation generated by human interference in the form of floodplain engineering, river regulation, climate change, and over-extraction of water for industry. But what we do say parties do not share a common view on is how this should be done. Environment Victoria has submitted, and this is effectively an overview or a summary of the submission made on behalf of Environment Victoria. Firstly, has submitted that it is entirely appropriate and required that the projects be assessed according to normal environment effects processes. The project's environment effects must be assessed in their broader factual and legislative context. This context is that the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanism enables more water from the Murray-Darling Basin to be allocated for consumptive use, such as irrigation. The projects are a component of the SIDLAM. Projects must be assessed in light of the fact that they are a mechanism to reduce the volume of environmental water that would otherwise flow through the Murray River and inundate the floodplains under the Basin Plan. For this reason, the projects will have detrimental impacts upon the relevant floodplain ecosystems, which extend beyond the areas of the projects. The project's environmental effects must be assessed by reference to feasible project alternatives, including timing and extent of inundation events, which could avoid, minimise or manage effects on matters, including Aboriginal and historic cultural values and potential cumulative effects. The project's environmental effects must be assessed in light of the cumulative effect they will have with the other VMFRP projects. And the environmental effects must be assessed in the context of the findings of the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin Royal Commission. These findings provide compelling grounds on which to conclude that the EES relies on invalid and unlawful assumptions. Further, it is Environment Victoria's submission that in the context of the State of Victoria's obligations to traditional owners and Aboriginal Victorians, the projects cannot be considered to have met the EES scoping requirements issued by the Minister for Planning because they do not identify the Treaty Act as the relevant legislation, and assess the specific requirements or implications for the projects arising from that Act. Further work must be undertaken before the committee can complete its function of advising on the significance and acceptability of potential environmental effects of the project. It is submitted that deficiencies in the EES must be addressed. These are detailed on page 3 of our submission document 156, and they include failure to adequately consider feasible alternatives, the impacts on sites outside of the VMFRP and the impacts of all 9 VMFRP projects, failure to apply best available science in relation to the Living Murray projects and the Source Murray model, failure to properly account for climate change, an overstatement of general benefits, assessments and proposals in relation to dealing with impacts on vegetation, failure to adequately assess risks related to water availability and to resolve adaptive management priorities. EV puts to the committee that the following findings should be made. That the committee should confirm that deficiencies exist in the current EES, meaning that the projects in their current form have failed to adequately address the scoping requirements. These include that Objective 2 of the VMFRP will not be met by the projects as currently proposed, and the EES does not adequately respond to the requirements of relevant legislation regarding traditional owner rights. That the cumulative, facilitated and indirect impacts of the projects within the context of the VMFRP and the SIDLAM have not been sufficiently addressed. That feasible alternatives such as constraints, relaxation measures have not been properly considered. There is not sufficient likelihood that the SIDLAM and VMFRP, and therefore the projects, will deliver the outcomes they predict and rely upon for the environment. That there are deficiencies in scientific analysis as identified by notable experts in this assessment process, and that unreliable assumptions are made by the EES in relation to environmental, water and climate change, including in the absence of explicit representation of the VMFRP in the Source Murray model. What flows from this is that we consider that the committee must find that a supplementary EES addressing these deficiencies should be required by the Minister and prepared by the proponent prior to the committee finalising its recommendations to the Minister for Planning. In short, that's what we'll cover in our submission, and I'll now turn to some further detail in relation to the first aspect of our submission, which is project context. And in our written submission, we've divided this into a number of sections. We've reiterated details in relation to the scope of the committee's inquiry. We've provided detail on the context of the VMFRP, the SIDLAM and the Basin Plan, and the reasons why this context is a mandatory consideration of the committee in this process. And we've proposed appropriate findings for the committee to make in this regard. And so I'll commence with speaking about the scope of the committee's inquiry. And while I appreciate that an amount of this section is no doubt reiterating documents that are very familiar to the committee, it really does go to the heart of our submission in terms of matters that are in and out of scope for the committee. And so consider that it's appropriate for me to work through this in some detail, but happy to be guided by the committee if you would prefer otherwise. I would commence by...
Apologies, maybe I'll just clarify, is your intent to read through or you're expanding on the written material that's been submitted to the committee in that regard?
A combination of both, but for this section, largely to read through what has been provided in writing.
Okay, and I understand the position that you were and the emphasis that you're placing on it. Just to note, the committee has read the written submission as well. If that assists in your presentation, feel free to skip any components that don't need to be expressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I won't take you through all of the detail of your scoping requirements, for example. I'll bear that in mind. That's useful. Thank you. So as we've said at paragraph 9, we think it's important to reiterate some of the matters contained in the written submission Environment Victoria filed on the 14th of November. And that relates to the ministerial guidelines, which set out matters related to the scope of the task for an EES. And so in relation to cumulative effects, the guidelines state that a regional perspective can be helpful by putting the potential effects of a project in a wider context. In relation to indirect effects, and we'll come to this specifically later on, the guidelines do refer to the extent to which an EES must consider indirect effects will depend on a number of factors that we set out at paragraph 9A, small Roman numeral 2. And the guidelines also refer to a systems and risk-based approach. And also at paragraph 9, we've cited a number of case law authorities in relation to the process for this assessment. And effectively, the SCR decision stands for the proposal that substantial compliance is required with statutory requirements and regulations. This is a standard that's been accepted by Victorian courts as well. And the Prineus case for the proposal that an environmental impact statement must be sufficiently specific to direct a reasonably intelligent and informed mind to the possible or potential environmental consequences of carrying out or not carrying out the activity. So in short, the authorities stand for the proposition that statements of environmental impacts and assessment processes must accord with certain minimum standards, as I've spoken to. So now our written submission steps through a number of the key documents relevant to the process, and of course the committee will be aware and intimately familiar with its terms of reference. So I don't propose to speak in detail through the matters that we've set out in our submission at paragraph 10. The terms of reference also set out the reporting requirements for the committee, which include analysis and conclusions with respect to predicted environmental effects and benefits of the project and their significance and acceptability. Whether the projects are expected to result in overall improvement to the biodiversity values of the relevant floodplain ecosystems. Recommendations in relation to proposed alternative arrangements and feasible modifications. Findings on whether acceptable environmental outcomes can be achieved, having regard to legislation, policy, best practice, and the principles and objectives of ecologically sustainable development. Recommendations on specific measures to prevent or mitigate adverse effects, and findings in relation to matters of national environmental significance. The terms of reference also note that other statutory approvals may be required, and they include things such as a cultural heritage management plan, which we understand will be approved subsequent to the Minister's assessment of this process. Further, the context of this process also is framed by the procedures and requirements approved by the Minister for Planning on the 6th of December 2020. Again, this document refers to investigation and assessment of feasible project alternatives and design refinements. For example, and there's a list of potential matters, including timing and extent of inundation events, and that these alternatives are considered to avoid, minimise and manage effects, particularly on a number of listed matters that are set out in our written document. The procedures and requirements also include that the level of detail of investigation for the EES should be consistent with the scoping requirements. And the scoping requirements then set out matters to be addressed in the EES. They reiterate the systems and risk-based approach and state that the EES needs to put forward a sound rationale for the level of assessment and analysis undertaken for any environment effect or combination of environmental effects, which include direct, indirect, combined, facilitated, consequential, short and long-term, beneficial and adverse effects arising from all components and stages of the project. Also set out is the content and style of the main EES report. I would just note here that the requirement here includes a requirement that cumulative impacts be assessed with other existing and proposed developments in the region, including other VMFRP projects. There's also a requirement in relation to applicable legislation, policies and strategies. With this being that the EES needs to identify relevant legislation, policy, guidelines and standards and assess their specific requirements or implications for the project, particularly in relation to required approvals. I'd also just briefly refer back to the federal context of the environment assessment, that being the controlled action decisions of a delegate of the Commonwealth Minister for the Environment on the 19th of May 2020 and the 29th of September 2020. And we've set out at paragraph 15 of our submission a quote from the decision for the Belser-Yungara controlled action decision. And this was included a decision that there was not a reasonable basis for refusing the proposal that the project be dealt with separate to the other VMFRP projects, because each of the other floodplain restoration project referrals to date have been determined to be controlled actions. The acceptance of the referral for, in this case, Belser-Yungara, will not reduce the ability to achieve the objects of the EPBC Act, as further assessment would allow consideration of impacts arising from that project in the context of the larger VMFRP. Effectively, at paragraph 16, we have really summarised then the key conclusions that we draw from this broad context, which is that the committee must report on environment effects and benefits of the projects, particularly in relation to their significance and acceptability, and in relation to biodiversity values of the relevant floodplain ecosystems. That the EES must include feasible project alternatives and design refinements. And that the level of detail of the EES must be adequate to inform the assessment of the effects and their acceptability. And that the EES must consider cumulative impacts, including from other VMFRP projects, and an evaluation of the implications from implementation of legislation and policy. And we also just note there the requirement in relation to consideration of offsets or alternative management proposals. Now I will turn to what we say that means in relation to the VMFRP, the SIDLAM and the Basin Plan. And really we say that in the context of the scope that I've just spoken through, the projects must be assessed within the context of the entire VMFRP, the SIDLAM and the Basin Plan. This is because the Minister for Planning requires the committee to report on the acceptability of the projects by considering the EES, which must include feasible project alternatives such as management measures and timing and extent of inundation events. And this must be done with sufficient detail to inform assessment. And we say that the committee's terms of reference are clear, that the structure and implementation of the Basin Plan, the SIDLAM and the Environmental Water Framework are outside the scope of the matters to be examined by the committee. As the terms of reference say, they are for context. So we're not asking the committee to examine and make findings about the structure and implementation of these documents and processes. Rather, the committee, by its terms of reference, must consider these matters as relevant context. And that means that it should inform the committee's assessment of environmental effects of the projects. And this interpretation is reinforced by effectively what we've heard throughout this hearing and the significant references to such context throughout the EES documentation. At paragraph 18, we've referred back to some paragraphs of our 14 November submission, which I don't propose to take the committee to, as that has been before the committee for some time. We also submit the indirect effects of the projects as projects enabling the reduction of environmental water to be provided to the Murray River must be considered because their indirect effects, which are reasonably foreseeable, have a strong causal link with the projects, are capable of being accurately assessed, could be significant enough in the context of relevant policy to impinge on the acceptability of the project, and these will not be addressed through other statutory mechanisms. And that's effectively referring back to what the guidelines say need to be established when considering the extent to which indirect effects should be considered in this process. In light of this context, we say that the committee should make a number of findings. The first is that it's entirely appropriate and required that the projects be assessed according to normal environment effects processes. This finding is supported by decisions of the Federal and State Environment Minister to require environmental assessment of the projects, the scoping requirements, the terms of reference, and related legislation. I might just pause here to say that to refer back to something that was raised on behalf of the proponent on day one of the hearing. And it was really sort of put to the committee that there's a question about the Environment Effects Act, the ministerial guidelines, and the assessment of impacts for a project, which they assert was wholly conceived for ecological benefits. Our submission will be that this is an unhelpful and inaccurate representation, and we'll take the committee to some context on this. But in that context, Proponents Council sought to create a distinction between projects such as transport infrastructure projects and mines, which have a defined and permanent intervention on the environment, and these projects. We would say that it's impossible to see how the construction of infrastructure such as regulators, culverts, pumps, pipes, and other permanent infrastructure is dissimilar to an infrastructure project. We would suggest for the committee a more useful example, and we say that that's of a renewable energy project. We say that because such a project is developed for the benefit of certain individuals who will profit from the project. The project will do good for the environment in many ways. However, constructing the project would result in permanent negative impacts on the environment. For example, a hypothetical renewables project may require the destruction of the sole habitat of an endangered species. And in this instance, a feasible alternative might be considered, where it's determined that, say, a maintenance shed is not actually necessary for achieving the aims of the project, because the purpose of the shed can be achieved in another way. Tools could be stored elsewhere. I think it will become clear as we progress through our submission how we consider that that kind of a project is analogous to the project being dealt with here. So returning to findings we say the committee should make, and I'm returning now to paragraph 23 of our tabled document 156. We say that the committee should find that the primary purpose of the projects is to adjust the sustainable diversion limit for the Murray-Darling Basin in order to allow greatest consumptive take. The ultimate purpose, or the sort of primary and foundational purpose of the projects, was not floodplain restoration. Paragraph 23, we draw out a number of statements from the EES, which we say would support that consideration. And critically, we also refer to findings from the Royal Commission report, which said that the SIDLAM is a critical component of the basin plan. Its application has resulted in a substantial reduction in the water to be recovered for the environment. That reduction has occurred through the application of poor public policy applied contrary to the requirements of the Water Act in order to fulfil a political compromise reached during the sometimes unedifying negotiation of the basin plan And so in this context, we say that the projects will have indirect, facilitated, combined and consequential adverse impacts upon large areas of the Murray River floodplain and downstream wetlands. The projects, as part of the wider SIDLAM, will facilitate managed overbank flows to only a small part of the Murray River floodplain, and as a consequence, large sections of the floodplain ecosystem will be stranded from a managed floodplain regime. We would say that the EES fails to adequately consider these kind of what we would say are drastic impacts upon areas of the floodplain which are connected to the project sites. It does not consider, for example, the crucial views of traditional owners about sites of significance for them which are outside of the project areas. A key issue in the scoping requirements is the potential for adverse effects on nearby and downstream water environments. EES fails to adequately consider the overall impact of reduced environmental water due to the VMFRP on downstream water environments. We say that the committee should make findings in light of the wealth, really, I would say, of scientific and other sources which point to matters extremely relevant to this process. They include that infrastructure-based approaches to environmental watering achieve some environmental benefits, but present significant risks to non-targeted wetlands. That environmental works are effectively default triage, where environmental watering is prioritised to a certain number of wetlands that can be flooded with a limited volume of water, while other wetland sites miss out. That environmental works cannot replace the function of natural overbank flows, repair ecosystems deprived of flooding regime, or be relied upon as a restoration technique. Let's say that offset water would mean acute damage for ecosystems like the Coorong, and that only the provision of larger volumes of up to 3,200 gigalitres would reduce the number and duration of consecutive years when salinity thresholds are exceeded for the Coorong. And also that it's likely that the SIDLAM type projects are only viable from an ecological perspective where combined with other techniques, including critically constraints relaxation. At paragraph 25, we also refer to the Royal Commission report, which we've tabled for the committee, and findings there about the amount of water recovery for the environment under the basin plan, and effectively that does not reflect an environmentally sustainable level of take. And we say that this is a key document for the committee because it's the result of extensive and forensic analysis of the basin plan and its implementation, and its findings should be engaged with by the EES. Shifting tack slightly, I will now turn to part 2 of our submission, which relates to traditional owner rights. Most importantly, objective 2 of the VMFRP is to facilitate traditional owner aspirations for restoration of floodplain ecosystems. And this is by engaging and collaborating with traditional owners to integrate their knowledge into the planning, delivery and evaluation of the VMFRP, and by creating opportunities for enhancing and sharing cultural connections to country. I'd like to now speak briefly about the consultation process that's occurred in this, in relation to this EES. As you know, and as you've referred to, under its terms of reference, the committee must review and consider any known views of registered Aboriginal parties, RAPs, and traditional owner groups, or must seek those views if they are not already known. We would say that it's concerning that requests from the committee to be provided with a process for making contact with relevant traditional owners was met with what we have considered to be resistance by state government departments and the proponent. And we say it's problematic because there hasn't been a system or clarity of communication about how traditional owners were informed. We're not saying that it's not then for them to make a decision about whether or not to be involved in the process. We, of course, agree that that is a matter for them to determine. We don't agree that anyone, for example, has been compelled to appear here or that they should. We've also noted that there are other parts of the Victorian government, such as the Department of, I'll say DECA now, DECA's Aboriginal Water Program worked extremely closely with traditional owners across the Lower Murray for several years, including in relation to waterway assessment methods that appears has not been engaged in, and as well as that, the requirements of Parks Victoria under its statement of obligations. We refer in our submission briefly to the submission made by Mildren, and in that regard, we would just also draw the committee's attention to a finding from the Royal Commission, which supported Mildren's assessment that consultation failings in relation to the SIDLAM deprived First Nations of an opportunity to provide their informed views, not only on individual projects, but also on the system-wide impacts of a 605 gigalitre reduction in recovery. And we would say that that's relevant because for reasons that we'll come to, including in relation to the Treaty Act, there are certain timing related considerations about that really feed into how equal effectively engagement is. Consultation engagement with a fully formed project is one thing. Consultation engagement at the point at which Mildren would have asserted should have been factored into these projects was found by the Commission not to have occurred. And I'll just note that at paragraph 32, we say that we're not here proposing to make any comments, and I want to make this extremely clear. We don't want to sort of express any comments on the views expressed by specific traditional owners that are before the committee. We're really here concerned with process and what the committee needs to have had before it to be satisfied that it can complete the role that it has in relation to these projects. Specifically now, I would like to talk to the Treaty Act, which we have mentioned is an act that's not engaged with by the EES. We would say that the relevance of the Treaty Act to this process cannot be understated, and that is in part because of aspects of the treaty legislation that I have set out at paragraph 33 of our submission. The preamble of the Treaty Act effectively talks about Aboriginal Victorians and the state working in partnership at all stages of the treaty journey, which we would assert has commenced with the passing of that legislation, which was a choice made by the state of Victoria. In the preamble, the state recognises the importance of the process proceeding in a manner consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including free, prior and informed consent and consultation and cooperation in good faith. And just further reiterating our position that these obligations have commenced and exist is the reference to sort of the first step having been taken on the pathway towards treaty. We would also say that one of the purposes of the Act is to advance the process of treaty making, not just the treaties themselves, and that the Treaty Act binds the Crown in the right of the state of Victoria. The parties to the treaty process, which include the state, under the Treaty Act must at all times act in accordance with the guiding principles set out in that legislation. These principles include fairness and equality, and this is fairness between parties as they work together to advance the treaty process, partnership and good faith, mutual benefit and sustainability, and transparency and accountability. And some further context is provided by the second reading speech of that bill, which included statements that the bill marked the start of a new relationship between Aboriginal Victorians and government, one defined by partnership and self-determination, and a critical step towards reconciliation. It requires a new way of doing things. As the firm belief of the government that at all stages of the process, it should be guided by Aboriginal self-determination as per the United Nations Declaration. As we've said, the EES does not provide evidence that the proponent and its project partners, including government departments, have turned their minds to or discharged the onus that rests with them as a result of the Treaty Act. The EES, for example, presents evidence related to traditional owner interests in standard form cultural heritage reports, and without meaningful engagement with traditional owner interests and aspirations throughout all specialist reports. We would then say that there are deficiencies in the EES in relation to Objective 2 of the VMFRP, which I have spoken to earlier, related to facilitating traditional owner aspirations. And effectively, our submission here is that aspirations cannot be, in the context of the Treaty Act, as we've just spoken about, meaningfully incorporated into the projects if the starting point is to ensure that a group understands what is proposed for each site, and where the standard for traditional owner engagement is to endeavour to give time for free, prior and informed consent where appropriate. While there is a reference to the opportunity for traditional owners to withhold consent, there's not further information about how this has been factored into the proposal for the project and how it would be rolled out. We think it's important to be clear that traditional owner engagement of the kind required by UNDRIP and the Treaty Act is separate to the requirements of the Aboriginal Heritage Act in Victoria, which is effectively mandatory requirements to protect cultural heritage specifically. Having said this, we do note in our submission at paragraph 37 the large number of Aboriginal cultural heritage components that will be directly impacted by the projects, including scar trees. And we note that the CHMP process is ongoing. We'd also just refer back to the failure of the proponent to call an Aboriginal cultural heritage expert as part of this hearing and the implications that that's had on the ability to test the conclusions reached in that specialist assessment. And the EES does deal with traditional owner engagement and does indicate that it has sought to incorporate traditional owner knowledge and science. But we have heard from experts of the proponent throughout this process that aspirations of traditional owners have not been factored into specialist assessments and that planned meetings with traditional owners on site did not occur. As one example, in Chapter 3 of the EES, there's reference to bush medicine related aspirations of particular traditional owners, and we could not find evidence of that in the relevant specialist assessments which consider the impacts of the project. We also say that there are a number of other more specific matters that the proponent's experts confirmed that consideration wasn't given in relation to fauna, in relation to totem animals and cultural significant species, in relation to weeds and pests, and that cultural burning practices were not specifically considered in the assessment of bushfire risk. We would say that these components mean that the EES is fundamentally flawed in its approach to traditional owner engagement, and that this cannot be rectified by small changes or a supplementary document provided at the conclusion of this hearing. we consider that significant re-engagement and traditional owner-led project design is required for the projects, or if this has occurred, we'd be surprised to learn that that level of detail has been missing from the EES documentation. I think I've made these points really, so I won't propose to further take the committee through the detailed paragraphs 41 and 42. Other than to reiterate that point that we've made about the need for sort of proper development of the projects in genuine partnership with traditional owners to meet the requirements of the Treaty Act. And in that regard, I did just want to make reference to an example. I did just want to provide this information in a summary way. We're not suggesting that this is the process that should occur here, but can provide further information on this for the committee if it's of benefit. But it's of the what are called the KNY, the Kungun-Narrandjeri Union agreements negotiated by the Narrandjeri Regional Authority and the State of South Australia. Sort of around 2009 and onwards. And so this is a somewhat outdated reference, and I think it's actually notable for that reason. These agreements, and I'm quoting here a reference by a number of authors, Steve Hemming and others. It's a document about Indigenous nation building that was published in the Journal of Environmental Management in 2019, reflecting on these agreements and effectively that they were the starting point for collaborative negotiation, decision-making, policy and natural resource management. And this source particularly refers to an agreement that was negotiated in relation to an issue around hypersalinity and soil acidity. Initially, in this instance, the state government had proposed a solution to the problem, which involved constructing a regulator. However, from the traditional owner perspective, the structure would be permanently anchored in the waterbed and obstruct cultural principles in relation to interconnectivity. So instead, an agreement was reached where a temporary bund was agreed, a modified engineering process to minimise cultural harm was undertaken, and there was an agreement to remove the bund when an independent scientific panel with equal representation from the traditional owners and government decided it was appropriate. It's been reflected that that agreement was based on the principle of respect for Indigenous sovereign authority and was a very significant development towards decolonisation and reconciliation. And I make that reference particularly in the context of the points that we've made around the obligations that the Treaty Act puts on the state. And I'll now pass to Ms. Hogan to speak to the third part of our submission.
As Ms. Mabry's noted at the commencement of our presentation, I will be speaking to section 3 of Environment Victoria's written submission, which relates to what we say are the key deficiencies in the EES. We say that these are critical matters which must be addressed before the committee can make an informed decision in relation to the significance and acceptability of potential environmental effects of the project. At paragraphs 44 to 47 of our written submission, we have reiterated the legal framework for the EES. Briefly, section 3 of the Environment Effects Act requires the Minister to specify procedures and requirements that are to apply to the preparation of the EES in an order declaring the project to be public works. Those procedures and requirements include here that the level of detail of investigation must be adequate to inform an assessment of the potential environmental effects and their acceptability and any relative alternatives. Australian courts have also made observations in relation to the minimum standard to be applied, which Ms. Mabry's already referenced in her submissions earlier. Importantly, the scoping requirements for the projects requires evaluation of the implications of the projects to be undertaken in accordance with the principles of ecologically sustainable development, which includes the application of the precautionary principle. ESD is defined in Section 4 of the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability Act 2003 as development that improves the total quality of life, both now and in the future, in a way that maintains the ecological processes on which life depends. It is our submission that the EES in its current form is inadequate to inform an assessment of the potential environmental effects of the projects, most notably in relation to indirect, combined, facilitated and cumulative effects. I note that earlier in our submission, Ms Maybury has provided an overview of the inadequacies and inconsistencies in the EES as identified by Environment Victoria, and I propose to address each in turn in my oral submissions. The first deficiency identified relates to the failure to adequately consider feasible alternatives. Throughout the EES, there has been consideration of the implementation of the projects against a do nothing or no project scenario as required by the scoping requirements. However, it fails to adequately engage with or consider feasible alternatives. In order to satisfy the scoping requirements, in our submission, there must be consideration of the projects in the context of the 36 SIDLAM projects that are currently proposed and have been committed to by basin states under the Basin Plan, which are currently due to be delivered by June next year. During the hearing, it was the evidence of expert witnesses called by the proponent that the projects have not specifically been considered in the context of proposed constraints relaxation measures, for example, in that there has been no reference to modelling that's previously been undertaken by the MDBA of constraints relaxation measures. Modelling of those measures was completed by the MDBA in 2012 and represented basin-wide water recovery of two scenarios, recovery of 2,800 gigalitres per year and 3,200 gigalitres per year. Subsequent work was also completed by the Wentworth group of concerned scientists to better understand the extent of inundation that could be achieved with those projects. The absence of proper consideration or modelling of flows that could be delivered with less infrastructure, less intervention, and less river regulation is not consistent with the scoping requirements or the principles of ESD. We say that it is telling that the experts for the proponents expressed their opinions that natural floods would be desirable and beneficial for the ecology in the areas of the projects, but they were not asked to consider a scenario where this was possible wholly or in part. The proponent has asserted in its Part A submission that constraints relaxation measures alone cannot be considered to be an alternative to these projects, but would instead operate in conjunction with VMFRP infrastructure. If this argument is accepted, detailed consideration of the impacts of constraints relaxation measures on the projects must still be provided in the EES, and it is currently absent. The second deficiency identified relates to the failure to consider impacts on sites sitting outside of the VMFRP project sites. The scoping requirements provide that the description and assessment of effects must not be confined to the immediate area of the projects. They must also consider the impacts on environmental values downstream and in the broader area and region, which all significant adverse effects must be considered in the design of mitigation measures and monitoring programs. The EES does not adequately assess potential impacts on environmental values outside of the project sites, which will likely face decline in the absence of naturalised floods due to increased river regulation, climate change, and potential increases in salinity, blackwater events, and displacement of species. This was confirmed by experts for the proponent during the hearing. In our submission, without proper assessment as required, potential impacts of the projects on nearby areas outside of the floodplain and within the broader region or area remain uncertain. Of note, the EES fails to adequately consider the requirements of the Ramsar Convention and the fact that the projects will inevitably change the ecological character of a number of Ramsar sites. Article 3.2 of the Ramsar Convention requires Australia to report to the Ramsar Convention Secretariat if the ecological character of any Australian Ramsar wetland is likely to change. The third deficiency identified relates to the failure to adequately assess the impacts of all 9 VMFRP projects in the context of cumulative impacts. During the hearing, experts indicated that this assessment had not been undertaken due to lack of information currently available relating to the works that are proposed at the 7 remaining floodplain sites. Specifically, it's understood that designs for those projects at all 7 remaining floodplain sites have yet to be finalised, and therefore the construction footprint remains uncertain. Where data about the cumulative effects of all 9 VMFRP projects has formed part of the EES, for example, in Table 11-2 in Specialist Assessment B, which provides an overview of cumulative effects and benefits expected for the 9 projects. We say that this information is not able to be assessed by the committee in its full context, as the EES and environment reports for the other VMFRP projects have yet to be completed. The EES does not consider the cumulative impacts of the VMFRP projects in the context of the river system, which is inconsistent with a systems approach. And it does not account for the impacts that the delivery of infrastructure across all 9 sites will have on environmental matters, including water quality, flows, and ecological values. Further, there has been a failure to apply the best available science elicited from the Living Murray projects and ongoing monitoring that's occurring at those sites. We say that this is problematic in 2 ways. Firstly, in this presentation, the Mallee CMA stated that ongoing monitoring of the Living Murray projects has occurred and that this information would be available. We submit that this data and information should be classified as the best available science, which is required to meet the objectives of ESD. Evidence elicited during the hearing indicated that the experts had not been specifically briefed on the unintended or indirect adverse impacts of the Living Murray projects, except perhaps in relation to hollow replacement nest boxes that were delivered at those sites. The second implication relates to the assessment of indirect impacts. The works proposed at Hatter Lakes North in particular have been designed to build upon environmental works previously delivered under the Living Murray projects. Accordingly, consideration of indirect or residual impacts of that project is central to this EES. For completeness, we note that data from monitoring the Living Murray projects has been requested by the committee, including information on whether unexpected or adverse outcomes have been identified, and the committee's also sought advice on the specific learnings that have been applied to the VMFRP. In our submission, however, this has not been adequately considered by the experts in compiling specialist assessments and reaching conclusions as to likely effects and impacts which form part of the EES. The 5th deficiency that's been identified relates to the use of the source Murray model. The scoping requirements refer to a need to describe the existing conditions and potential impacts on surface water. The modelling of current flows using the source Murray model is outdated and does not provide a proper baseline to assess the impacts of these projects. As noted in the EES and in the expert statement of Dr. Treadwell, the MDBA has indicated an intention to update the model to more accurately provide a whole of basin view. The current source Murray model links together 24 individual river system models from the Murray-Darling Basin states and territories to describe the surface water resources of the basin. The model draws on data collected from 1895 to 2009, which predates critical river regulation and infrastructure projects that have since changed the surrounding landscape and river flows. A study conducted by the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists was raised during the hearing and revealed discrepancies between observed and expected flows, with the expected scenario having been based on the source Murray model. Relevantly, the Wentworth Group found that excluding annual climatic variability, observed flows in the reach of the Murray River at Hatta from the years 2012 to 2019 were 23% less than the MDBA's model projected. This also relates to the sixth deficiency, which we've identified as the failure to properly account for climate change. The limitations associated with the modelling of flows also affect how climate change is accounted for throughout the EES. The assessment of the impacts of climate change as required in the scoping requirements draws consistently upon findings in the MDBA's climate change stress test, which purports to be a broad, imprecise indication of how the Victorian Murray Floodplain Restoration Project will be impacted by a changing climate. It was suggested during the hearing that this data was an appropriate basis because it covered conditions ranging from drought to extreme floods. However, the findings of the Murray-Darling Basin Royal Commission included that climate data for that period, 1895 to 2009, has limited relevance for the purposes of incorporating climate change consideration into the basin plan. The specialist assessment noted that the assessment of climate effects used the results of source Murray modelling and scaled flows based on guidelines for assessing the impacts of climate change on water availability in Victoria by DELP. The MDBA have noted that this modelling is suitable for assessing the general change in frequency of flow events required to undertake the various operating strategies for each project. However, the availability and deliverability of environmental water under climate change remains uncertain. The MDBA has also noted their intention to update the model to incorporate explicit representation of all the sustainable diversion limit projects, which will provide further insights into climate change effects. Further, in our submission, the general benefits throughout the EES are potentially overstated. For example, the basis upon which the benefits to species has been calculated in our submission remains unclear and has been overstated such that it cannot be relied upon. This issue was initially raised in public submissions, and as one example, a concession has been made in the expert statement of fauna ecologist Mr. Holmes that the benefits to growling grass frog have likely been overstated. The eighth deficiency we've identified relates to the impacts of native vegetation removal, which are significant. The projects propose to remove 50.3 hectares of native vegetation at Belsar Youngra and 18.9 hectares at Hatta Lakes North. As a result of the projects, it's expected that 842 large or very large trees, including 354 hollow-bearing trees, will be lost. The proponent has proposed that the project should not follow the ordinary offsetting process under the Victorian planning process. In our submission, this is inappropriate in circumstances where the overall improvement to biodiversity from the projects cannot be known with sufficient certainty and could take 60 years or more to be established. It is also inappropriate as the Victorian planning provisions do not enable consideration of alternative arrangements. And also the EES documentation does not consider a feasible project alternative of delivery of environmental water to at least some parts of the areas of the projects by way of delivery of constraints relaxation measures that have been committed to by basin states, and may mean that a lesser extent of construction could be required for equivalent environmental outcomes at the project sites. Further, the proposal to remove a significant number of large and very large trees, including hollow-bearing trees during construction, has not been properly considered in the context of residual and indirect impacts, particularly in relation to surface water and groundwater. For example, the removal of for example, in relation to evapotranspiration, risk of salinity and risk of soil erosion. The ninth deficiency, as identified by Environment Victoria, relates to water availability and risks that are not adequately addressed. The proponent asserts that while legislative and policy matters represent a critical backdrop and regime within which the proposed works will operate, they are outside of the scope of the matter. They are outside of the scope of matters to be considered by the committee. According to the proponent, this includes policy around water allocation and water availability. In our submission, however, considerations relating to water allocation and availability cannot be divorced from the assessments of the impacts of benefits, which are based on the assumption that water will be available at the times, frequency, and in the volumes required to achieve desirable outcomes. During the hearing, we note that experts have agreed that water availability is a relevant matter when assessing the projects. Finally, we submit that adaptive management issues remain unresolved. Throughout the EES, its specialist assessment chapters and the proponent's expert evidence during the hearing, reliance has been placed on adaptive management. Adaptive management has been referred to as Lower Murray Water confirmed that adaptive management processes are critical to the project. It's referred to in the environmental delivery standards in attachment 2 to the EES documentation in relation to pest, plant and animal management, native vegetation, threatened species and ecological communities, erosion and ensuring the structural integrity of infrastructure, groundwater quality, including salinity and surface water. Adaptive management has been referred to throughout the specialist assessment that forms part of the EES. It's been referred to by the proponent's experts throughout the EES hearing. Experts have confirmed during the hearing that they did not and were not required to consider how adaptive management for various features of the project will interact with one another, even when adaptive management is proposed as the mitigation measure for multiple risks within their relevant area of expertise. We submit that the proponent's extensive reliance on adaptive management to deal with the impacts and effects that should have but have not been properly assessed for the purposes of the EES is inappropriate and demonstrates the highly experimental nature of these projects. Ultimately, Environment Victoria submits that the published EES is insufficient for the purposes of Section 3 of the Environmental Effects Act. It is not consistent with the scoping requirements or the ministerial guidelines, and overall is not fit for purpose. Most critically, the exhibited EES does not allow for the transparent assessment of the environmental effects of the project, and the evidence to date is also insufficient for that purpose. That concludes our oral submissions, Chair. We'd be happy to take questions, perhaps after the break, if convenient.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan and Ms. Mabry, for your submissions. I'm actually going to propose that we move into some committee questions now. I estimate probably up to 20 minutes of questions. Obviously, we'll see how that actually goes, and then we might take an extended break before coming back and hearing from this afternoon's submitter. So we'll move straight into questions, and I'll hand to Member Bell to start. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your submission. You've mentioned the Murray-Darling Basin Royal Commission key findings and have, I note in the footnotes, referred to some of these findings specifically, but are there any other findings relevant to the SIAC's terms of reference you would like to highlight?
I think we've proposed in our submission the key findings, although we would say that it is extremely relevant context to considerations of the effects of the projects, and that effectively the EES must propose the projects in that context and contemplate the impacts of the findings of that commission on the likely success of the project.
Thank you. In paragraph 24B, you say that the EES fails to adequately assess the overall impact of reduced environmental water due to the VMFRP on downstream water environments, and further at C, that infrastructure-based approaches to environmental watering achieve some environmental benefits but present some significant risks to non-targeted wetlands, which are the overwhelming majority of ecosystems not inundated by this approach. Do you say the reduction in environmental water to downstream environments and the risks to non-targeted wetlands is due to the diversion and use of water within the VMFRP project areas, or the reduction in the basin environmental water recovery target associated with the VMFRP?
Thank you, Member Bell. We say the latter, the reduction in environmental water.
Thank you. And in your original submission at 56G, you said that the project includes stop banks which affect ecological character, and the projects will essentially desiccate areas of wetlands and convert them to dryland ecosystems. Is that in relation to the project works embankments or preventing flows to other wetlands as a result of directing the water to these project areas?
We might have to take that question on notice, Member Bell, just because that section of our submission was referring to comments made in other submissions in the process. So I'd need to just return back to where we had taken that reference from.
Oh, okay, I apologise. Thank you. And over to Mr. Ham, thank you.
Thank you very much, Member Bell. Member Ham has a few questions. I'll hand directly to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your submissions. I've only got a couple of questions in relation to the traditional owners. So my first question is in relation to, as I understood it through your submission, that you're suggesting that the proponents have met what they're required to do at a minimal level in terms of the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act and other requirements?
Yes, we're not proposing, not submitting that there's been, and to some extent we can't know until the Cultural Heritage Management Plan is finalised, but we're not asserting that on the evidence in the EES, there's evidence that the legislative requirements of the Aboriginal Heritage Act haven't been complied with.
Yep, okay. Now, in relation to the Treaty Act, your submission articulates is centred around the preamble of the Treaty Act, and it's probably a little bit technical, and bear in mind I'm not a lawyer, so just want you to work with me on this. The proposition I'm thinking is your argument that the proponent hasn't met the let me put this a different way. Is your submission based around whether the proponent has acted not in accordance with what you're saying the Act requires, or hasn't acted within the spirit of the preamble? Because I think they're two, my view is they're two different things. If it's, say, a regulatory or a specified thing, say within the Aboriginal Heritage Act, it's quite clear what you're to do and what you're not to do. A preamble, however, is open to interpretation. So I just wish to clarify, are you saying that the proponent hasn't met the specifics as articulated in the preamble, or that they haven't met the intended spirit of the preamble?
Yes, thank you, Member Ham, and that probably wasn't made adequately clear in our submission. What we are saying is that the proponent and project partners, which include government departments, haven't complied with Section 21 of the Treaty Act, which is that a commitment of the parties to the treaty process, and those parties include the state, to at all times act in accordance with the guiding principles that are set out in the Treaty Act, in the sections of the Treaty Act itself, and that these guiding principles include matters such as ensuring fairness and equality, partnership and good faith, mutual benefit and sustainability, and transparency and accountability. So it's effectively that is the crux of our argument. That's what we say the state, as part of the project proponents here, is required to do. We'd say that the preamble informs the interpretation of the Act, and particularly the understanding that the commitment and the commencement of the treaty process has commenced. And so when Section 21 says at all times, we're at those times now.
Yeah, that was where I was getting to, was that in your view, the Act has commenced and therefore is binding on the state and its instrumentalities to act in accordance with the Act itself, even though the treaties themselves have not yet been negotiated.
That's correct, particularly because some of the sections of the Act itself, not the preamble, but the Act, talk about the process of treaty making, and it's in our submission impossible to see how that process has not commenced with the commencement of this Act. And I mean, as a more practical example, there is already existing the proposed treaty negotiation framework, which is one of the components of treaty that this legislation requires to be established. And that sets out the kinds of matters that may be negotiated in treaty, and that includes matters related to water at this stage. I mean, I think that provides us context with which, if these projects are proceeding to drastically alter through construction, particular key areas to traditional owners, that will impact upon what is on the table for traditional owners in the future in terms of how they can have a say about those sites, and particularly sites of cultural significance within those areas. So I think it would be the wrong interpretation of that Act to consider that, particularly in the context of the principles I've referred to around transparency, good faith and fairness, to be undertaking actions now that whilst in the process of treaty, that would impact upon that future stage of specific treaty negotiations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so just to be clear, so this project or any other projects, and not just limited to the Murray River projects, but any project, I guess, undertaken by the state from the proclamation of this Act should consider the Treaty Act and its implications going forward.
Yeah, and in part we would say that because the Act says at all times.
Yes. Thank you. That's my questions, Chair.
Thank you.
Sorry, Chair. I just wanted to return to that first question of Member Bell in terms of the Commission report. If it would be of benefit to the committee for us to provide some further detail on aspects of that report that we consider should have been part of the EES but have not been, we are happy to take that on notice.
Thank you, Ms. Mabry. I think that we will not require that at this stage. Thank you. And also to note the question of Member Bell that you indicated you may take on notice, that there's no need to return and respond to that question either. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your submissions to the committee. We have no further questions. So thank you for taking the time and attending this morning. We really appreciate it. We are running ahead of schedule, and I would like to ask Dr. Kelly if she could please put her camera on. I propose that we do take an early lunch and that we come back and sit in an hour, unless that is an issue. I understand our lunch break was scheduled for 1, and that may cause a dilemma for parties if you had something else scheduled. But first I will find out from Dr. Kelly if that is an option for you.
Sorry, what are you asking?
If we have an early break, well, we will have a break now, Dr. Kelly, and we're running ahead of schedule. So I'm looking, if we do take a break, to recommence at 1 p.m. Is that to hear your submissions at that time?
That might be okay. I'd just have to confer with the other member who's going to be here. So, but I think that will probably be okay. What time did you propose?
So let me just pause before we do that. And could you give me an indication, is that something you're able to do very quickly?
Yes, it is.
Okay. My other question is just to confirm, I don't believe I've seen any additional written material come through from your group. Is that correct? Just to ensure that we haven't missed anything.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to do it. So I think Nicole McKay might have sent something through, but I'm not sure. I haven't spoken to her. I'm expecting her. We both live in Swan Hill, so she lives around the corner. So I'm expecting her here presently.
Right. Is that additional written material something you're relying on in the submission that you're about to present to the committee?
Not myself. Nicole might be.
Okay. All right. I'll ask if you...
her to say. She's been talking to Amy, I think.
Great, thank you.
We were having technical difficulties, so she can, yeah.
Okay, I'll get you to clarify that when we do come back to you. Before we make a decision definitely about the length of the break and recommencing at 1, Dr. Kelly, could you please confirm your other fellow representatives' availability to attend at 1, and I will just ask the proponent if that rescheduling has any issue, you've got any issues with that.
No, we're fine with that, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. So Dr. Kelly, is that something that you're able to advise us on now?
Yeah, I'm just texting her now. So.
Okay, thank you. We'll just hold tight for a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, don't probably best not to hold our breath. So
okay, you're confident though. I'd like to be sure before we break, but
I'm fairly confident. I can always start anyway, and then
okay, that sounds fantastic. Thank you.
We're tag teaming.
Okay, so we will break now and we'll come back at 1 o'clock. We'll see everybody then, and we'll hear from Dr. Kelly then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. So I'd just like to note that the committee members sitting this afternoon are myself, Member Kirsch and Member Bell. So Member Ham will not be sitting this afternoon. I thank him for sitting with us this morning. We have via the committee's received advice via the Planning Panel's office that Dr. Kelly would like to commence at 1:30 due to availability of her co-presenter. The committee is happy to accommodate that, and I'll just ask Dr. Kelly if she could pop her camera on for a moment and just confirm that that is the case. Or Dr. Kelly, if you can give me a virtual thumbs up, that would be great. And if you're not there, then I'll assume that that's the case, and we will break for half an hour and come back at 1:30. Just give it another minute. Okay, I can see Dr. Kelly joining us. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. I was just confirming that you have requested to be able to start at 1:30.
Yeah, that would be much better for us. That would be suitable.
Okay, no problems. Well, thank you. I'm happy to accommodate that, and thank you for being flexible as well. So we'll see everybody at 1:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Welcome. So we'll move straight into your submissions, and I understand that you do. I can see that we have another representative of the group. I'll ask if you could please introduce the other representative at the beginning of your submission as well. Thank you.
We're both going to come on my computer.
Okay, no problem.
Yep.
Welcome.
Thank you.
That feels weird.
Two people.
Yeah.
If it's easier and might just the logistics of it, you could just, whoever's the one speaking could be the one sitting in front of the screen if that makes it a little easier for you.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Yeah, or during COVID, I haven't done a lot of Zooming, so I'm not that au fait with it. Whereas my daughter is a teacher, so she is very au fait with it. Good
Dr.
afternoon
Kelly, if you could
to the-
introduce, I think it is Ms. McKay, if you could do that introduction at the beginning as well. Thank you.
Today from Friends of VMFRP Park, we have myself, Jackie Kelly, and another member, Nicole McKay. Is that all you want?
That's great. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
I'm here.
Thank you. Yes, welcome. We can see you. So we're over to you, Dr. Kelly. We're in, if you can just take us through your submission, that would be great.
Okay. Good afternoon to the committee, and thank you, Chair Kendall. I'd like to firstly pay respects to the Wamba Wamba and Wadi Wadi traditional owners of the area that I live, the Swan Hill Rural City, and pay deep gratitude and respect to their elders, past and present, and also to other nations in the project areas that we are speaking about, including the Tadi Tadi, Lachi Lachi, and others. And I would like to state that sovereignty was never ceded. Friends of VMFRP Park have had Wadi Wadi representation on our committee at all times. We formed in 1996, so it's coming up 25 years. Nicole McKay and I will present today on behalf of the group. It's approximately 8 years that we have been involved in these projects from when we first discovered that they were being thought of and developed. I'll probably speak to our submission and some other historical information, and then Nicole will speak more on water and alternatives and other parts of our submission.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Could I just clarify that the submission, we haven't received any further written material, is that correct? And we're talking about your original submission.
Yeah, we are submission number 21.
Great, thank you very much.
I thought it was long enough that was enough. So today is World Wetlands Day, and there's a lot of stuff happening today that has made it a little bit difficult for me personally, emotionally. So I just wanted to say that first up. Our right to be involved and informed and heard has always been an important part of our group. We have dealt with many ministers over the 25 years, beginning with Marie Tian, and then Minister Garbett, talking about environment ministers, Minister Thwaites, Minister Jennings, and it was under Minister Jennings that national parks were formed and VMFRP Park was formed from being a state forest. So it was our group that took 15 years working alongside and with Wadi Wadi to stop grazing and logging in VMFRP Park. And this has given us a lot of history with the authorities, with the department, and with politics. So through successive governments up to now, with Minister D'Ambrosio, Minister Xing, and Minister Neville, and all the other ministers, Minister for Planning, and it's just all changed again. So for a community group, it's a lot of work to debrief the new ministers and the new bureaucrats. And I think it's only if you're part of a community group and a volunteer that you understand the pressure that can be put on you as a volunteer, and it's worth it, but it's also very tough, and it can have an effect on you personally and your family. So I want to state that as well. I thought I would just say that I was born here and educated at Swan Hill High School, and I moved back here in 1996 after going to university in Melbourne. And at that time, VMFRP Park was going to be logged by the Mildura part of the Department of whatever it was called then. And so the Friends of VMFRP Park started, and over the years I've been the chairperson, the secretary in different positions and worked alongside other people. Quite a lot of our members have passed away actually, and so we continue the work on behalf of them. So the Friends have stood by, organised, kept watch, gathered, demanded better, collected, learned, participated, cooperated, attended, networked with naturists, scientists, government, other environment groups, politics. And I have also served on the local Swan Hill Rural City Council, and I recently have just become a councillor again. So importantly, our group looks at all the values of the reserve, the public land, so nature, culture, heritage, recreation, tourism and health. And we have never just looked at VMFRP Park. We look at ourselves as a regional group caring about the region and the Murray River and its floodplain, both sides of the border. We're not a Victorian group. Each of our members has different skills, and early on we excluded anyone with a pecuniary interest. So initially we excluded farmers with cows and grazing licenses and woodcutters. So it's been a difficult journey because there has been, animosity in the community, but we've stood strong and tried to work respectfully and professionally. And fortunately, we've had a lot of fantastic members who have put in a lot of time and skill over the years. So I consider it one of the most important and rewarding things I've ever done in my life so far. Can I initially just check with you, please, Member Kendall, if we can have, will the proponents' lawyers be able to question us?
Dr. Kelly, just the committee. So it's only expert witnesses who are cross-examined by anybody, including the proponent. So we will have a few questions for you.
Thank you.
But we will hold our questions until we've heard your full submission. So,
Yep.
thanks.
Is it possible that the proponents' lawyers could turn off their cameras so that they're not looking, so that I can't see them?
Mr. Townsend, do you have a view on that? I'm comfortable with the proponent having his camera on through a representative having their camera on, but if you don't object, Mr. Townsend, I'll leave it. Do you have a view on that?
No, in your hands, Member Kendall.
So if Dr. Kelly would be more comfortable, Mr. Townsend, I will ask you to just pop your camera off during the submission. Thank you.
One of the important factors here is the precautionary principle, and it's something as an environmentalist that I have always worked under, and I feel like this presentation is difficult because I feel like some of the things I say will be telling the committee how to suck eggs kind of thing. I don't want to be disrespectful in that way, but I kind of just have to say yeah, I have to kind of start at the bottom, and yeah, I find it difficult with Zoom that we're not in a room, and there's a whole lot of things I can't tell how people are feeling or looking, or like there's a whole lot of things that aren't there to participate normally. So I'm sorry if I do it wrong or say the wrong thing or offend or whatever.
That's fine, Dr. Kelly. Just continue, and if we understand the challenges of meeting on Zoom, and we'll just all do our best. So thank you. Just proceed, and don't feel that there's things. Feel free to, if you need to go back to basics to put in the context, that's fine.
Okay. One thing I wanted to say up front was that it's when we started to deal with these projects and they were starting to get referred to the EPBC, we found it alarming that the EPBC has then allowed the Victorian government to assess its own project because of the bipartite, or whatever it's called, agreement between the Commonwealth and the state, and that the Victorian minister will get to advise the Commonwealth minister on projects that do seem to be so favoured by the Victorian government. So I wanted to express that. The whole thing that Mr. Townsend took time explaining on day 7 in the morning, 30 minutes explaining something about the circular nature of this process and how there's bureaucrats are going to advise the minister, and then the committee asks the bureaucrats questions, but they can't, like that whole, and he mentioned the word circular. It does make it very tricky, and you know, I don't want to be critical or out of line, but from where we sit as a community group with no resources, it's very hard for us to fairly participate and be part of that circle. There's also the fact that some of the submissions expressed the fact they don't want any EES, and that we should just move ahead with these projects. And that's possibly what was done with the Living Murray projects. Lots of money and lots of infrastructure was put in, possibly without an EES. But I think it's good that there's an EES. We asked for that, and we were happy that it was, even though some of the projects aren't getting an EES, they're only getting a report, but we're still hoping that's a thorough process. We cannot just do these mega engineering projects with no review, checks, an umpire, and a fair process for traditional owners to consider the risks and have proper community input, let alone spending this much money without due process. We agree with EV about the lack of clarity with the TO engagement process. What happened yesterday and those submissions that have been added to the Google Docs, that's all very difficult and would have been much clearer and easier and better if the hearing was in a local area where it's not all about letters and it's more about people. And yeah, it is 2023, and the fact that just initially I'm going to talk about, I know I've already mentioned our position on doing a site visit, and I don't think it's world's best practice. It's an expectation of planning law at any level, Commonwealth, state or local, in any court. You know, even VIAC came up here once and sat in Swan Hill to consider an issue about the clearance of 5 hectares of mallee vegetation, and they did the member did a site visit. If there are external timing issues to rush this process, I think there's been a lot of other things that have held up these projects, and if anything deserves to be given more time, it's this process. This process should not be considered a desktop process. If there's no site visit, then the committee members do not get a feel for the cultural landscape and how unique it is, and it's not holistic. And I feel that it's unfortunate that you will not meet us, you will not meet the TOs, you will not meet locals and fishermen, you will not meet the people who live here and are from here and care about these areas. I'll move on from that. So there's been a lot of letters go to the government over all those years of that I just outlined. There's been we've been a group that writes a lot of letters, which isn't always appreciated, but from the day one, that was how we that was our method of engaging with the government, and also in those letters, of the return letters, there's been a lot of platitudes from a plethora of bureaucrats and ministers, but none of them have given us an assurance or a feeling of positivity about what's going on. The department has failed over the years to gazette a lot of the parts of the Murray River National Park that Minister Jennings announced and legislated. The fundings of Parks Victoria has been inadequate. There has not been significant water advocated for the floodplain, which is what's led us to this. And the department has always had this tension between the Department of Environment and the Department of Planning Department of Agriculture and flora and fauna, and that's just what's playing out here now. I would suggest. So there's been a lot of fear and hesitancy by people to engage with this process, and that's a lot of what we feel now. There's been attacks, and especially during this hearing, the proponent, I feel, has attacked certain people, including myself. I feel like there was some intimidation, and a sense of what has happened locally has been like a divide and conquer. So a continuation of the old strategy of government of colonisation, of land tenure, of a the model you could say that the government uses, one of the philosophy of it is very at odds with what we probably need, the philosophy that nature should be cared for, and so that's what our group has advocated for a long time. So I suppose what I'm saying is that there's been it's been difficult for groups in this area, Swan Hill, because we are on the border of 2 CMAs. So the Mallee CMA is over 2 hours away from us, their office in Mildura, and the North Central CMA is in Bendigo, another 2 hours away, and the border sits just north of Swan Hill, a couple of kilometres out of town, which has made it difficult for us to engage with those authorities. And I would say this area is neglected, understaffed, and that's probably, if you have sensed any animosity or, from me, that is why, because for 25 years it's been such a struggle to get heard or meet with or get attention here for our nature reserves, our national parks, our waterways, our native veg. So these projects, under the stealth of COVID, there's been lack of meetings, no community meeting, unable to meet as a group. So we feel that it's been very difficult because COVID has interrupted the normal, and I'm sure what the department and authority people would have liked to do. The last 2 years, COVID has made it very irregular for community groups to engage properly and in a way that these projects deserve, and in a way that we're used to. I mean, we're 25 years old. We've engaged in a lot of processes, and this has been very irregular. And so I suppose that has made us feel even more kind of frustrated, ostracised, ignored, and things like that. Whether COVID was the real reason there was no community meeting or there were other reasons, it's hard to say. Of course, these projects have been going on a long time, so there's been a change in the people involved in them, and that means every time a community group has to deal with the authority, there's a different person that you have to meet, debrief, get up to speed with who you are, that's part of the difficulty as well.
Dr. Kelly, just apologies for interrupting. I was just going to emphasise that I understand that you're giving us the context and history for a reason to set the scene for your submission, but it would be, if you can ensure that you focus on the things that you would like the committee to consider in terms of the issues and what your group's looking for, that would be helpful to the committee.
Yep. That is part of my problem. To be succinct, to do this justice in such a short time is so hard, because we've been doing this for 25 years. So, and it's a massive, massive issue, like water, the river, nature, planning, like it's a massive issue. And over Zoom with a few minutes, I'm doing my best.
No, it's fine. It's not a criticism, Dr. Kelly. I'm just wanting to ensure that we do get to hear what you're looking for from the committee.
What I might do is pass on to Nicole, and then I'll come back after that.
And then you can go to the submission. Yep. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for hearing my perspectives on the Murray River Delta, between the confluence of the rivers, the Loddon River, the Warkall River, the Murrumbidgee River, and beyond to where Hatter Lakes connects with the Murray River system. I was born in Robinvale and I now live in Swan Hill. I grew up adjacent to a wetland floodplain called the Niavinifera Forest, and I spent the 80s and 90s, 2000s, throughout all that time enjoying and then monitoring the deterioration of this great wetland landscape. My father rode a rowboat with his father fishing in Robinvale as a young boy in the 50s and late 40s, and our grandparents and my grandparents on my other side spent many years on the Darling River. So throughout my years, I have spent a long time trying to understand the river system, and I continue to do that, canvassing the ideas of the older people around me. And I believe that over the past 5 years, with this bizarre implementation of the Basin Plan, I have increased my understanding of the working of the river system in this region. Please feel free to ask me to get on track if I'm not, but all this does relate to the projects in themselves. So I would agree with Doug Frood, and certainly Jackie would confer with me, and I would say the entirety of the community in this region, or maybe not 100%, because some people are younger. I'm very glad and appreciative of the fact that I'm 54 years old and that I did get to witness the floodplain in a functional, healthy, flowing system that it was until the mid-90s throughout my childhood. So we lived in this region. The floodplain was healthy, and we were an area that had a wet season, a cool wet season over this. And we had experienced regular flooding, inundation of the floodplain, Niavinifera, Boundary Bend, Yungara, Narung, the Robinvale floodplain. It went into the creeks and a multitude of lakes that are full at this very minute, but since the mid-90s have been denied water. One thing that I would like to say about this process of creating engineering projects is that it's a flaw in the technical information here, because the studies of fish and flora have been done after the Millennium Drought and after a period of water marketisation. So the ecological assessments that this project is saying is the baseline are based on a very unhealthy system as far as waterways go. And they could have based it on the studies that were done in the mid-90s or prior that Doug Frood referred to. And that is the system, what was beautifully functioning wetland ecosystem. Yes, the periods of flooding were reducing somewhat, but they were still occurring on a very regular basis. So most springs, almost every year, the red gum forests and creeks and billabongs received water. The lakes, many of the lakes, apart Hatter Lakes was reducing, but those that were close to the river system were receiving water, and regular flows above 20,000 megalitres at Swan Hill were experienced, and regular flows of over 40,000 megalitres at Robinvale. So I think we're being shown in all this enormous and vast amount of technical information here is a misrepresentation of what this floodplain was. Something else I object to is that they often refer to that this lack of water on the floodplain has been as a result of control of the river system, and has occurred over many, the last 100 years. And there's an element of that is true. But the big change in our water ecosystem here occurred when marketisation of water occurred in the mid-90s. So my oldest son is 27. We have pictures, and I would have loved to show you these pictures of him and myself in the floodplain with many water plants all over the billabong. So the whole region should be Kakadu without the crocodiles, essentially, and with a multitude of freshwater lakes that are ecologically healthy and with fish. Yes, there were carp there, but there were also other fish, but the ecosystem was functioning. We never had black water, we never had blue-green algae. I have canvassed the opinions of people who are 90 to 100 years old, and never in their recollection had they experienced, prior to the drying of the Millennium Drought, did they experience black water or algal events in this region. Water quality being a huge issue for health, but also recreation and tourism. I would like to emphasise that the people in this region like to fish, like to camp, but particularly we love to swim in the rivers and lakes. For the past 25 years, sorry, I'll go back a little bit into the history, the marketisation of water caused a great uptake of sleeper licences that were not used. So the water was over licensed, and it was that exact event that caused a huge increase in water use and deprived the floodplain in this region of water, and combined that with dry conditions. This caused a massive deterioration in flooding, but also we have had the issue that when the basin plan was signed, at some point it was agreed to allow upstream property owners to impose constraints on how much water could flow down the river system. So even when there has been enough water in the river system for the last 15 years, river operators have been constrained and not able to allow the Murray River and its tributaries to flow at high enough levels to cause minor flooding in this region. Now, when we talk about flooding, alarm bells ring. However, people in this, what our last flood has shown you is that this river system in this region has the enormous capacity to cope with water. And it has taken up that flood water very well and caused very minimal damage to private land in this particular region. In fact, I was speaking to older residents in Boundary Bend. They said in the 2 weeks prior to the flood reaching its peak, they said, we've got no worries here. The floodplain is the Murray River is 10 kilometres wide or 10 miles wide. The opposite to that story is that when that floodplain is deprived of water, we are seeing and witnessing and have witnessed ecological devastation in the last 20 years because of the deprivation of water. So we have an overgrowth of red gum saplings, and we have a death of the old red gum trees. This is very serious, and I would like to pay respects to cultural owners of this land and in all the different communities along the river system, and in particular Wadi Wadi, Latchi Latchi, Tati Tati, Barappa Barappa and Wamba people very deeply. To also acknowledge that I have witnessed the most alarming destruction of cultural heritage in regard to ring trees and scar trees and the death of these very, very important cultural places. And this has been devastating to me on a deep level. But also my most conscious thought is for the children that are to come and for the communities that they belong to. The other deprivation, what I've noticed most strongly in the last 20 years, is that the flourishing aqua flora, water flora that flourished in throughout this entire region, and I'm speaking about an area thousands of river kilometres, but approximately 150 land kilometres of river area and going into New South Wales, is that when I grew up, all of these floodplain areas had the most amazing aquatic flora, so water ribbon and lilies and all the small little plants all on top of them. So when the scenes that you imagine with Kakadu, I suppose when you see pictures of that, and they existed in all the floodplain that we used to visit, see, drive past, because you would see it regularly every year. After the Millennium Drought, the Blackwater event was so powerful, or the lack of water was so long, that there was very little return of any of those aquatic plants. And then I'm very, very devastated and sad to say that the flood of 2016, and then since then it's been only about 5 years since we've had some flooding into some areas past Swan Hill, because the flood last year in Swan Hill was quite small because of constraints, that there are no aquatic plants left from what has occurred, the keeping water off the floodplain. And I have not seen any of this, maybe very small amounts, but none of the perennial water plants. What this shows to us is that this system is fragile. We may recover from this current situation, but we will not recover quickly, and these projects will not cause a systemic recovery of a very important ecological and culturally important place in this region, in northern Victoria, because we've seen now what has been the impact. Now I would like to talk a little bit to the projects. The risks of the projects, we can see the systemic risks of the projects because of our current situation with the magnificent flood that has occurred. This flood should be the most wonderful environmental event, and on some levels it is the most amazing event, because we have the entirety of the floodplain has been inundated, and we have seen water in places that it hasn't been seen since 1956, and even 1956. And I can report that communities from here to Mildura are thrilled. We receive phone calls and messages saying, you should see the water here. This is amazing. People are overjoyed because we have been living in an area with a multitude of dry lakes. For those of you who live in the city, would you give up Brighton Beach? I doubt it. But these communities have experience living near lakes that should have water all the time. So this event has taught us a lot of things. It's taught us a lot about how we could manipulate the river system, and how, in fact, prior to 1995, the river system functioned to cause natural flow type inundation of the floodplain, and that could be done, I believe, with just the will to do it, because if we have now seen the total floodplain in its glory, and seen a high river at Turrumbary, and how much water is needed down the Murrumbidgee and so on and so forth to cause an inundation of the floodplain between Swan Hill and Mildura. However, the devastating thing is that after 15 years of managing I will say the different CMAs, the MDBA and a variety of other government bodies, we can say Goulburn, Murray Water, whoever, they have these projects are just a continuation of how the floodplain and the river system has been managed for the last 20 years, which is they've been managing icon sites and watering icon sites and pumping water onto other sites. These projects will see the floodplain managed in the same way. So Nifra is an icon site, and so is Burra Creek, and so is somewhere else. But in between these areas, there are large bits of the floodplain that will in all likelihood get no water, or there's no guarantee, no commitment from any government agency to work with river flows to ensure that water flows into those areas. Now, what we can see from the flood that has occurred, is occurring still right now, is the risk of this management system. The risk is that the organic matter builds up on the floodplain of the other areas, and the areas where the icon sites are watered become stagnant also and don't have flow back to the river system. And then what results when you have a large flood is you have these shocking black water events. So, and also on the other side of the system is when the river's in low flow, we are prone to blue-green algae. So this this river flood that we had started off as the most amazing thing. I live near the Loddon River, which connects to prior to Swan Hill and becomes the Little Murray, but I live near a river. When the flood started, you could hear the insects and the frogs, and it was a cacophony for a couple of weeks. And then there was silence because the black water came and there were no frogs, there was no noise, and the noise has not come back. This moved down the river system. So, and I would love to be able to make a presentation with photographs. So out at Nyavunifra, with great joy, people were canoeing and fishing and swimming. Sorry, not fishing, but canoeing and boating and going onto the floodplain and going into the billabongs. And then within a couple of weeks, Murray cod were seen in there, large Murray cod, you know, a foot and a half long, that changed colour, turned white and have died. And this has occurred right up the river system. I was speaking to an 80-year-old man in Boundary Bend. He said, well, the river's, all the floodplain is so beautiful to have it, but he said it's black. This never occurred in our life. So this is in our young years. This is the system of management that is being proposed by these projects, and it simply will not work for the project sites or for this entirety of the river system. And the risk is to the entire system of the Murray-Darling. It's a risk to all these different tributaries and the Murray River itself. And the incredible risk is in water quality. It is acknowledged, I believe, in the original exhibition of these projects, Burra Creek and Hatter, there was a fish management plan, and they seem to have done another fish management plan. But in my recollection, there was a risk acknowledged in the fish management plan at the site where the water is impounded of black water, so hypoxic water, blue-green algae, and fish getting stranded. Some of the mitigation strategies proposed were rescuing the fish, agitating the water, and pumping more water in. This, to me, is not a feasible management system for any lake but this is actually an irrigated piece of the floodplain, and it should cause alarm bells. However, I think even in this flooding event that we have, there have been reports out of the Living Murray projects that there has been very dark water pouring out of the bottom of them, because none of these projects give any guarantee of maintaining the original flowing water system that did occur through them. And that I can tell you that the communities from every stretch of the river are deeply concerned about black water and blue-green algae, which really destroy our way of life, but they destroy the plants and animals that live in the river and in the floodplain, which should be, just centre points of enormous amount of life. I'd like to speak about one species in particular that lives in within the sites that are being proposed, but also within the entirety of the river system. So the Murray crayfish during the 2011 flood, we saw thousands of crayfish. Firstly, I would like to say that this region was in the past recognised as a wonderful place for Murray crayfish to grow, because it has very little river regulation. So between Turrumbary and Robinvale, there are no weirs, and that can cause cold water and other things that are not suitable. Also, many of our creeks that go into the floodplain, the locals recognise that Murray cod would go in there with the flood, but also they're called names like Crayfish Creek, and people would catch a lot of crayfish back in the years before they were protected. So this is an area recognised as a great place for Murray crays to grow. I certainly grew up eating them. But during the 2011 flood, when there was a massive Blackwater event, we walked along the river and there was a crayfish every foot of the way, and that went all the way along the river, you know, the river system in this region. So that Blackwater event, I just want to keep repeating, is a result of a lack of small floods, small and regular floods. Small and regular floods into the floodplain are needed to wash out the organic matter and to flush the system regularly, and they must have flow. And when that organic matter builds up for 10 years or 5 years in various parts of the floodplain in this region, we have these massive Blackwater events. So it's a result of thinking that you can irrigate one little part. So in 2011, we lost these crayfish climbed out of the water. I mean, in a way, it was sort of exciting to see how many there were, but most of them have probably died. There was a study done, I think, within the last 5 years, looking at population since 2011, and there was an 80% decline in the crayfish population. Now, in 2016, again, we had huge amounts of fish deaths, and unfortunately, I was very hopeful that we would not see the same hypoxic water events because it had been only 5 years since a flood. However, we were not spared, I'm sad to say, and there were crayfish. But what I'd like to report is that there were very fewer crayfish, and that was so tragic to see the systemic impact of those Blackwater events that have occurred in the past 12 years. And the crayfish population in this region has not recovered, and the continuation of this approach about building and impounding water, letting the rest of the floodplain go dry, the ongoing consequence will be death of plants and fish and animals that live in the water, and an ongoing risk to humans and communities as well from poor water quality. I would like to talk a little bit about the consultation process in regard to free, prior and informed consent. What I've witnessed is that the proponents and the Mallee CMA have been very reluctant to have community meetings, and that is because, and I've been told this, they know that the community are very hostile about the project, because people here are obsessed with river flows and very interested in such things. They are extremely knowledgeable about how high the Murrumbidgee needs to be to create a good flow at Robinvale, that sort of thing. And so they can imagine a system and would like to be part of working to make a great basin plan. But they see most people in the community, fishermen, people who use the river, people who've lived on the river for all of their life, cannot in any way understand how these projects can be functional at all, because they create stagnant water essentially. And they are also, that people laugh at pumping, they just throw their hands up in disbelief about why you would get a pump and pump water into a site when 15 to 20 years ago they saw water flow into those areas, and they know the flow rates required to help the system function well. So in regard to consultation, there's been an absolute lack of public meetings, and there's been an ability to say to young people, we are going to restore this area because it's been deprived of water for 20 years. But you can say that to a young person, and you can say that to a young person you recruit to be a floodplain manager or work for incredibly large recompense on these projects, and they might feel that they are doing a wonderful job, because you can create all of this in a nice light, because we're looking at a system that's been deprived of water essentially through government policy after policy after policy, the marketisation of water, and then the lack of action on allowing higher flows at certain areas that would not inundate towns or any houses, but it would maybe inundate land that was always inundated before 1995. So there has been a lack of consultation, a lack of openness with the community about the process. And I can even report that I attended a fish forum where a high manager on one of these projects told people not to ask any questions about the projects because they couldn't take it. And you just got a sense from the community, the people who had gathered there to talk about fish. It was largely populated by fisher people, that they were extremely concerned and hostile to the projects because they're not ecologically functional. And the other concerns that we have and expressed widely across the community is that these projects are going to require a great amount of human resources, ongoing and forever. Do we think those resources are going to be there ongoing and forever to manipulate, monitor the water, lift the levee, close the levee at the right time, organise the flows to be there at the right time? We doubt it very much. I think I would give the functionality of these projects about at the most a 20-year limit, and then we may end up with a lot of stranded infrastructure on the floodplain. What I would propose as an alternative is that we have a regional community gather to utilise the knowledge and understanding of traditional owners, of older residents from Robinvale, Balranald, Swan Hill, and Nyah and Boundary Bend, people who have a good understanding of the river system, and work together with the CMAs and to actually create projects that work on a functional river system in this region where we have a healthy floodplain, lakes that are regularly full, and a fantastic horticulture system, which is what a smart country would do. And we are a smart country, and I do believe in us, and I believe that this is what we could do. I do not see that there is evidence in the engineering projects that they have utilised the knowledge of older local people who would understand functioning of the river system prior to the last 30 years, but those people are there and they are wanting to share their knowledge. Oh, yes. So thank you. Now, another thing why I do understand and believe that is possible to achieve inundation of this floodplain on a regular basis through the use of better flow management is that last year people in our region were absolutely perplexed about why the dams were so full, and the Murray River had been kept very low and dry, and people were starting to get distressed and say, why is it that the Murrumbidgee is in flood, the Darling River's got floods, or the Lachlan, all these other river systems, and yet we've got all that water sitting in the dam? So I put a notice of motion to our council that was supported to ask the environmental water holder to release some more water from the dam to create a flow into our environmental system here. And that had council support because it would also have made more space in the dam, which everyone wants a bit more space in the dam to reduce flood risk, but also protect irrigators' licences. And that was done for a very short period of time, only less than 10 days. I think about 10,000 megalitres of water was released down the Goulburn River, and we received a flood of 20,000 megalitres at Swan Hill and achieved the inundation of most of a lake system close to Nyah on the New South Wales side, and inundation of the vinifera forest into its billabongs and creeks. And this was achieved very easily. If it had been able to go on for longer, we would have got a greater inundation. But at that time, below the Walkall Junction and below the Murrumbidgee Junction, there were good flows that went into the floodplain in that region. It seems as if, and with all due respect to the Mallee CMA, who do have their their environmental watering plans, that they seem to go on without any consideration of trying to take advantage of river flows or enable or have river operations assist in the healthy functioning of the river system in our region. And this has caused, not doing that, has caused the death of thousands and thousands of hectares of a functioning aquatic ecosystem, and it could be regained, but it needs flow. Everybody knows that. Every fish expert will say what is required is water and flow. It is not water and stagnation. It is water and flow to have fish, and it is quality of water to grow those aquatic plants that support birds and other aquatic species, and also ensure water quality. It has been quite distressing to see that those in charge of river flow management have not consulted the local community as they say they do. Maybe they tell people about their watering regimen, but there is such a wealth of knowledge within the community about how they'd like to see the river system functioning. I live in hope and try to believe that we'll be able to work on this to improve this together. These projects need to go back to the drawing board. They are an absolutely unnecessary and incredibly dangerous, beyond expensive consideration that has been developed without local community involvement, without any co-design or utilisation of, on many occasions, local advice that was given 15 years ago has been ignored on events. And it would appear that the deprivation of water on the floodplain it seems as if the deprivation of water in this region has almost been managed that way in order to justify these projects, because these projects are essentially a function of someone's plan as part of the basin plan instead of water recovery. So that seems to be their main reason for existence, is to prevent water recovery. And their main reason for existence is not to ensure the survival of the environmental and cultural wonderland that the mighty Murray River in this region should be, not for us, for the traditional owners in this area and their families and their communities particularly, but also for our entire nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mackay.
Chair Kendall, do you want me to continue or?
Yes, please, Dr. Kelly, you're welcome to continue.
Okay.
Right, Dr. Kelly, I will do a time check with you as well. And again, not to hurry you up, but just so that to assist with some planning for the afternoon.
Yep, I'm under your direction, Member Kendall.
Do you have an idea of how much longer you need to present your content?
Look, it is hard, but I'm not sure what you want me to say. Do you want me to?
Okay.
I could probably fill the space, but I may not.
Okay, that's fine.
I won't need more time.
No problem. I'm just wondering whether we need to schedule a break at some stage. So we started at 1:30.
Yep.
We might do a 10-minute break.
Yep.
I will need to go. I have work commitments. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much for coming along. We appreciate it.
Is it possible at all that I could send a photographic presentation? I just had so much difficulty in managing that.
So,
I would love.
Ms. Mackay, please continue to liaise with the Planning Panel's office, and if it's able to be provided in the next 24 hours, and if we have any questions, we can ask you, and just to allow the proponent time to review that material so that they can provide any response if they need to in their closing.
Thank you. That would be wonderful, and I would really appreciate that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we might break now just for 10 minutes and we'll come back at...
Member Kendall, before Ms. Mackay goes, could you check if any of the committee want to ask her a question?
I'll be happy to take a
because she's
question.
going to go.
Thank you. I will just ask if there are any questions from the committee.
Member Kendall, I did have a number of questions that I was going to ask and progressively been answered. But there was one quite detailed question in relation to the Friends written submission that I was going to answer. I'm not sure who's best placed to answer that, but I might raise it now if that's appropriate. At the conclusion of the Friends written submission, there's a reference to the Kundruk Paracuda project, and we understand that's part of the Living Murray initiative. I'm just wondering, given that you mentioned it, but there's not a lot of detail in the written submission, wondering whether there's any implications arising or learnings arising from that project that would be of relevance to the two projects that we're considering.
People in the community from that region say that some of the original plans were less, I want to say invasive, but that makes it sound like a weed, but less large and more with community information. And I believe the negotiation with the local landholders was problematic, and a lack of support from the community has caused lack of function. We have had people present who live downstream of the creeks that come out of there, where it has been accused that blackwater has, flowed out of Kundruk Paracuda forest. I like to emphasise that regular flowing flooding is the cure for blackwater, but when water ponds and is stagnant, but also when there's a build up on the floodplain from lack of flooding, that is when we have these events. But this has been reported. So it's so important that, and we've seen photographs, and I believe there's been inquiries about this sort of thing, but also we've heard from this flood event that there's been fear of water coming out of the bottom of that forest. I'm only saying, I guess, things that are being heard, but I think more community involvement and community faith in the functionality of any projects is very important to ensure that they will be able to have longevity and actually assist the floodplain.
Member Kirsch, I'll just say a few words on the Kundruk Paracuda project. It was like it's not near us really. Like Kundruk Paracuda's an hour from here. But the groups there have been quite vocally against the projects, and so we've heard whispers about it. And then there was a meeting in Coralie about the New South Wales SDL projects called the Connections Project, and we went to that, and there were a couple of fellas there who are engaged by the what's that group called? There's a community group over there, and they actually have funding to employ a couple of biologists and landscape. Anyway, they presented at this Connections project and explained. I was quite shocked to hear about the Kundruk Paracuda project. I'd never heard this before because I haven't lived here. I've been away and lived other places and stuff, but seemingly a lot of money was spent building it. It was built wrong. It didn't do what the community said. So the community demanded that it not be used. And so it was sitting there unused for years. The community demanded that it get changed. So it was kind of held up. So a big waste of money, a big white elephant. And now that these big floods have come, only time will tell in the review of what has occurred there, what impact that project had on floodwater coming down the Murray and affecting downstream areas and possibly causing more damage than should have happened. That's what's spoken about. I would be happy to get information or give you the name of people who know more about this than me, but I thought it was important for us to put that in there because it is a risk that perverse outcomes happen, that these you know, that was a living Murray project. You would think it would be well planned, well executed, but it wasn't. It was done and then was held up by the community demanding that it not be used. So risky, waste of money, not done properly. So can we trust the government? Can we trust the engineers who are proposing these projects? I think that's a good example of a project that was not done with the community's backing. They didn't listen to the community, to the learned people in the community who could have forewarned that, coming in over the top of community, building what people say isn't going to work. So I think please look at that project. I can give you the name of that group. I just can't think of it off the top of my head.
I've just remembered someone I've spoken to just very recently from that community said that the original design had flow. It was supposed to have flow. And then the next design that was put over the top was much more of a ponding of water. So there are many, many occasions when I'm talking about the community would like to work on things. There's an example at Boundary Bend. There's been an amazing inundation of some floodplain that hasn't been inundated for years. And that was caused by the very high river we've had, but also a levee bank broke. And I had people on the phone to me yesterday saying, who can we talk to in the government to try to ensure that levee bank isn't built again so that that lake gets full? There are a lot of little structures and things that people know. There are a lot of little channels going into the river that have been filled in by sometimes the CMA to pump water into and hold it there, that can be removed, or things that white industry has put in places that will help the floodplain function. But the most important thing is the first action should be that the constraints part of the basin plan is enacted and that we work on flows. It's so important to get flow. There's not a single project that is relevant without flow. There is not a single person in this entire region who has history on the river who wants to see a site have water pumped into it, because fish don't go up a pump, and neither does good water quality, and it doesn't have longevity. And no one likes to see wastes of money. We need to get our river system, the river system, functioning and flowing. All we need really is 10,000 megalitres down the Murrumbidgee, 7 down the Warkle, and 20 to 25 at Swan Hill, and you'll have great flows, and it can be done. There are these things. It's the will to have our most important river system functioning well for our future generations.
Okay, thanks. I understand what you're saying, and that's a matter that we can investigate ourselves. Just one last question if you've got another couple of minutes, Ms. McKay. And it's in a similar vein. You'll be aware, Dr. Kelly, that we've asked the proponent to provide us with further information about the Living Murray projects, particularly Hatter Lakes, and we're awaiting a response to that. But is there anything you wanted to say in a similar vein to the Children's Paracuda project? Are there any learnings that we can take from the Hatter Lakes project to assist us?
One thing I would say is that the Hatter project is an important project, and potentially, the river, that lake system is far from the river and further from the river, so requires higher flows. However, nonetheless, I do believe it's also had some issues with water quality. However, from our perspective, and this is potentially not the information you are looking for, it actually feels like the environmental water has been bought from this region and dumped at Hatter. So we've provided water to an icon site and left the river system to die in this region, but we're protecting that icon site. So that is the risk. The other thing that I found very, very strange was that, and that Mallee CMA can please answer or correct me if I'm wrong, that in this time of extremely high dams being full, I think that water was pumped into Hatter Lakes very, very soon before the floods. And I do question why there wasn't an effort made to release water down the river system and connect the Hatter system to the river system itself. And that seems quite a bizarre action to me. And also pumping was planned for various places in our region in the previous 6 months and year when there was enormous amounts of water in the dams, and we could have worked with getting connected flows. So that's another reason why local communities are very fearful, because although in the projects, these particular engineering projects, they do say if the river's high enough, they'll connect to the river system, but there doesn't seem any will within our local supposedly catchment management who in their charter should be about managing the catchment for the health of particularly the river system. If it's a catchment, there does not seem to have been any will to maximise the use of a high river or help the river to be higher. It seems to be running past us and running past us fast most of the time. We've got the same problems with bank erosion, running past us fast. But this particularly seems to be absolutely wildly bizarre, and you would wonder, how did that environmental watering plan ever pass muster when we've had dams that were 90%, 95% full, and we've consequently had devastating floods. So that is why everyone's incredibly suspicious that all these engineering projects will simply be pumped full of water, and that even when the river system is full, I've heard very smart people say they think that they want them closed so that they can stop water going there when there's not enough water for irrigation. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Kirsch, I would say from my, I'm not saying I have extensive knowledge, but from my understanding, from what I've learnt and seen and heard, that the Hatter Lakes project is successful. It's had an incredibly positive outcome for those lakes, but my concern is that we are applying a cookie cutter situation across all of these areas. Just because it worked at Hatter Lakes, it doesn't mean it's going to work everywhere, because I would hope that most of the committee would understand that yes, it's a river, yes, it's a floodplain, but each geographical area is unique, and each reserve, each project area is very unique geographically, hydrologically, everything. So this cookie cutter process of applying the same thing that worked at Hatter to everywhere else is very, I've said it, engineering arrogance. It's, it's very easy for a human to build an edifice, to build something, and they're a champion, and isn't it wonderful? But we have to be cautious. We cannot think that we are, so wise and so almighty that we can build these things and not absolutely ruin these places in nature, in the cultural landscape. And the thing is, it's not just like a bad haircut. It won't grow back. we cannot remove these things. They are going to be permanent. And the fear is that it will be a terrible, terrible thing that we will put onto our children and our future generations. They will look back and say how stupid we were.
What I would like to say is that this, I would love it if the planning panel, I'd like to reiterate what Jackie said. It's such a shame to be speaking to you when you're so far away, and it would be so wonderful for you to see these river systems, and they've just been in flood, and the scenes have been amazing, but it's a good time for understanding these things. But I cannot say anything more than to say the risk of these projects is the systemic risk in particular. There is cultural heritage risk in every part of every aspect, and ecological risk, but we're seeing the systemic risk now. We've just had a massive blackwater event that has killed enormous Murray cod. We have seen lakes with fish all around the outside. we cannot ignore the impact of trying to manage it like a few irrigated sites, because the risk is every 5 or 10 years we have this large, and eventually, gradually, there will be no crayfish. I do not know how the crayfish population is ever going to recover from the event of 2011. There were far fewer crayfish this time, and we cannot keep having this assault on our the largest rivers.
Okay, look, thank you. We understand what you're saying to us, and I'll try not to take Dr. Kelly's observations about bad haircuts personally.
Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate you listening carefully, and I will go.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mackay. Thank you for taking some questions before you go to. So Dr. Kelly, I know I asked you previously and you weren't sure, but I would like to get an indication of the time that you think that you'll need to present the rest of your content.
Probably 30 minutes will do it.
Okay, so we will break now. We'll break, it's just after 2:45. So we'll actually break till 3 and we'll come back and the committee may have a few more questions after your presentation, Dr. Kelly. So I'll see everybody at 3 o'clock. Thank you.
Yeah. What I can do for you in the, yeah, sorry, what were you going to say?
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. I'll hand directly to you to continue your submission. Thank you.
Thank you. With our submission, we are, attempting to participate in these EESs, as is our right. Because the 9 projects were split into 3 groups with different processes happening for each one. We haven't been part of an EES before. I know I've said that before, but the submission was made. I think my opening line is, although this submission is on the central package, there are many general comments that apply to all the 9 projects. It's unfortunate that the projects risk seeing conservation areas damaged and the floodplain triaged in the most brutal way, saving icon sites, but leaving the rest to perish for the sake of keeping more water in the consumptive pool and not giving it back to the river. In the context of the politics of water, we cannot ignore that context. I'm going to just take out little bits of the submission. I'm not going to read through it because that would take too long. And I know that the committee has read it. The desecration of the cultural landscape was part of what prompted our group to form, because in creating a road in the local floodplain forest, the road was made through a midden, and so the local Wadi Wadi representative put an emergency declaration on, and that was part of what started our group. So our group started, and then we joined with others like Yorta Yorta and the Barma Miller Collective and Friends of the Earth. And then there was a cross-border campaign to save red gum and create red gum parks with New South Wales and Victorian groups working together with traditional owners along the river. This is just a summary of the history. And we learned a lot of patience and persistence from the traditional owners who we stood beside. And then there was a push for co-management, and Yorta Yorta achieved that. And Naivanifra Park was proposed to have co-management for Wadi Wadi, but that has not yet eventuated, unfortunately. Then there was a River Country campaign with an alliance of different groups and Friends of the Earth leading that. And then with the Millennium Drought and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, these SDLAM projects were proposed 8 years ago. And even through the whole thing, that a lot of the same people are around, a lot of the same employees of the agencies, and the same, we all know each other quite well, although we haven't seen each other for a long time. So through all of this, learning about the Victorian, the Commonwealth planning scheme and the way we think of land tenure and land ownership, we've learnt a lot about that, and colonisation and land rights, and the whole thought about land, who owns it, who has an interest in it. And there's been a lot of playing people off against each other, playing groups off against each other, interventions that have had to happen. It's unfortunate that the traditional owners in this area don't have RAPs, some of them, and I think that the project proponents have taken advantage of that, and that's been a disadvantage to those traditional owner groups that don't have RAPs. If you compare, say, Wadi Wadi with Jaja Wurrung, if you compare the resources and the staff that those different traditional owner groups have, it doesn't really seem fair that Wadi Wadi or other groups with no resources have been expected to participate and on a fair level in this process. And I think that's important for the committee to understand how unfair that is, and how it's very similar to colonisation, to the history of, you know, the frontier wars, to the murder, the dislocation, the cultural destruction and racism that still exists in this area. We are the safest National Party seat in Australia. And ironically, these projects and the white anting of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is acknowledged, that the National Party are a big part of that, and Barnaby Joyce and Little Proud, the undermining and you know, the high hopes that we had for the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and our group's always been a supporter of the plan, but these SDLs and the trying to whittle away that water that was given back to the river, it is all part of this issue, because if you see the river as a pipe and only for extraction and only for the consumptive pool, and you don't value nature and conservation and the cultural landscape and the rights of the traditional owners to care for country, then of course you will propose projects like this, and you will propose less and less water. And that 16 billion that was allocated to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is going to be wasted, which as a taxpayer, I do care about that, and we all should care about that. So it's very, I have found it very confusing, and well, not really confusing. I have found it yucky and difficult to watch what's going on with this situation, with the way that the proponent has conducted themselves, with the, you know, writing letters to the Victorian government is very advanced in its treaty and stuff like that, but it's still very clunky in the way it deals with walking alongside First Nations people. And I don't even have to say it because it's just very obvious with this project how clunky it is. I don't want to, yeah, I'm not going to say any more on that. Sorry, hope everyone had a cup of tea. So, sorry. The proponent is now Lower Murray Water, but the proponent initially was the CMA. And no one ever was able to explain to us why the CMA handballed it to Lower Murray Water. I mean, I pay Lower Murray Water a bill. I've got a bill from Lower Murray Water for my water and sewerage. So I find it hard to know why they became the proponent. And, all those all those staff members from the CMA, it was just a very confusing, and to have Lower Murray Water as the proponent when they don't really, I'm not sure why that happened, but or what it was all about. The project supposedly built on the Living Murray, and it could be said are a grab for cash for implementing. I seem to have a grab for cash for implementing a cookie cutter approach of irrigating the floodplain. One of the previous members for Mildura's name was Peter Crisp, and I appreciated his frankness when he described these projects as irrigating the floodplain. They're not marketed like that, but that's essentially what they are. And the central package is a good example of comparing two very different landscapes, but using very similar invasive infrastructure to solve the problem. I think it's obvious. I tried to include in the submission all the different things that we've been involved in. There's not really any process that has happened in this space in our region that we haven't been involved in. We made recent submissions to the Barwon-Darling floodplain harvesting rules. Last year, our group co-hosted a River Peoples Forum, and Nicole, who just spoke, has been part of organising these for, I think, the last 5 years, annual regular community forums, bringing the knowledge of a variety of different learned people to this area to educate the community on the river and water. And I think that's significant, and it's outstanding. So we've been involved in putting out media releases, which I've included one of them there. And all this takes a lot of coordination and a lot of networking and meetings, discussions. So I suppose what I'm trying to show you is that we have been a very organised group. We have spent a lot of time working together, discussing things, understanding things, and then trying to affect outcomes and trying to help achieve the aspirations of the Wadi Wadi people, and also help with the improvement of our environment, our river and the floodplain. Look, I think most of my submission is quite self-evident. I'm not going to read it, and I think you've all seen that I've participated in this for 8 days now, and I suppose you could say I've said my piece where I could, trying to ask the questions, and I'm just going to flick through and see if there's anything that I feel I should highlight. One of the things that I have tried to ask some of the proponents, experts, is whether these areas are undersurveyed or oversurveyed, or surveyed just the right amount. Because from all of our time being involved in natural resource management in this area, particularly of the floodplain areas, is that they are undersurveyed, under-researched, and not enough is known. And I think, you know, if we destroy things that might one day be a cure for cancer, or you know, we don't know what we're going to destroy. In regards to the cultural heritage and cultural landscape, I feel like the proponent, and it's hard to say this about the Victorian government, an authority of the Victorian government, but I will say it. I feel like they're acting like a mining company, like Rio Tinto destroying the Gorgon Caves, or Fortescue Twiggy Forest causing fractures between the community to try and achieve the goal of opening the mine, causing, you know, real trouble in community, putting people up against each other, causing division, and I think it's perverse, and it's wrong, and it's not fair, and the outcomes that will happen for these effects from this process are going to stay with us and stay with our community, and we're going to have to try and patch things up and make peace and recover from these for who knows how long. I think Nicole said before that the proponent in their application to the EPBC lied about both our support of the projects and other group support.
Member Kendall, I'm going to have to interrupt, I'm afraid. I'd ask the chair to there's been now a number of highly inflammatory comments and remarks, and in fact, probably defamatory remarks around the client, its behaviour or strong language. And I'm finding it difficult, Member Kendall, just to, particularly off screen, but to say nothing about the tone and the language and the highly politicised language. There are facts and matters that are properly the subject of these assessments, but there seems to be a fair amount now of more insulting sort of commentary. And I just ask the chair to be mindful of that. And we have a lot of people listening into this hearing who are personally engaged to do their jobs every day and ought not, in our submission, have to listen to insults about in their professionalism or otherwise, unless there's real reason, and particularly with what is a wide-ranging apparent assertion about who the submissions are made on behalf of. So I simply raise it, Member Kendall, maybe we're getting to the end anyway, but there is a point at which we'd say that the process ought keep on the rails, as it were, and be respectful to all parties.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. Certainly hear your concerns, and I'm definitely happy to ask Dr. Kelly to proceed, being mindful of the language that she's using and the implications of the submissions that she's making. Mr. Townsend, before you do, I hand back to Dr. Kelly to continue. Is there anything you're particularly action you're looking for me to take in that regard, or you're just wanting to make your concerns
At this stage, I'll just ask that it be stated and that Dr. Kelly refrain from personalisations or accusations that are out of line. There are very good points to be made, and by Dr. Kelly, no doubt, but it's unnecessary in our submission for it to stray into unfounded accusations or personal attacks on organisations or on people. But having said that, there are other matters arising that have been arising, and not just in this submission, but others that I will be addressing you about, but I might take the opportunity as a preliminary matter tomorrow morning. But
yes, thank you, Mr. Townsend.
I don't want to interrupt the submission for that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I anticipated that you may do that. Dr. Kelly, so on that, with that in mind, and I do agree with Mr. Townsend, it's very important to be cautious about the way that you present your concerns, but I'll invite you to continue with that in mind.
Thank you. I don't think I had said any personal names, but and I didn't intend to. It is a fact that in the EPBC submission, which was put up to the EPBC, that they did lie about our group's support of their projects. We were not told that the projects were being referred, so we didn't get time to put in submissions about VMFRP. We got very limited time to put submissions in about other things. So the transparency and respect was not there. So there's only so much disrespect that you can abide before you start feeling a little bit upset. Yeah. I feel like we're nearly getting to the end of what I feel that we wanted to convey. But I'm just going to take a moment to just double check, because this is our last opportunity. You know, the committee, the committee could hear from us in private, then, you know, we would like, it is difficult in this public forum to, I don't want to have to say some of the things that I am saying, but they're true. They're true. These things have happened. We have been treated this way, and it's almost dystopian. But Mr. Townsend probably would find it hard to believe too. He may not.
Kelly, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
He may not have been briefed on some of this stuff, and because there has not been any public meetings, there's a lot of limitations up here with the low population, small population, the distance, the isolation of these places, the lack of media coverage. We don't have a strong media here. Our newspapers closed during COVID for a while. There's a whole lot of limitations to the community being heard, to the community feeling heard, and that includes the traditional owners, that I don't know if the committee would understand fully. And so I suppose that is what I'm trying to explain to you, because I think it is important. One of the things I said at the preliminary, I can't remember what that thing was called, but the first Zoom we had about that just how difficult it is for these projects to have come at us like a freight train, that we feel like we can't stop.
So, Dr. Kelly, I just have a question for you. I would like to ask that now. I know that you were still just checking whether you'd covered off on everything that you wanted to mention.
I'll just say before you ask me the question, the responsibility that you feel when you are a community leader, and I don't think I'm being arrogant saying that, it's an enormous responsibility, and I do take it seriously, and our group takes it seriously. But it's also very tenuous and very yeah. Go ahead.
So, Dr. Kelly, at the beginning of your submission, you talked briefly about the membership and representation of your group. I was just wondering if you could explain that to the committee, just so we have a good understanding of the geographic reach and your membership.
Most of our members are from probably 20 kilometre radius around Swan Hill, the 20 to 30 kilometre radius. We're a 25-year-old group, and look, you would have to say we are organic, And that's probably a nice way to say where, because we're so old now, I would say that we don't comply with the rules as such, meaning Parks Vic would like us to become a, fill in forms and comply with all these things. But I suppose, well, I myself, I'm a bit grumpy with bureaucracy, and I can't be bothered filling in forms like that. And I don't find, I suppose I'm,
Dr. Kelly, I was just really more interested in the representation. So there's no need to run through those details. I can hear, I can hear what you're expressing there. So, so it is just on getting close to 3:30. I'll just ask if there's anything else or any other final remarks that you needed to make. And just to acknowledge as well, of course, that yes, your participation in the hearing, as you mentioned earlier, and that we understand your submission, and we have reviewed and read your original written submission as well.
Look, I did want to make a comment that I feel that some of the behaviour of I suppose I haven't found this an easy process, and I'm like, no wonder that traditional owners don't.
Oh, Dr. Kelly, I need you to refrain from commenting on people's behaviour at this stage, and also other people's participation. So, if there's nothing else.
Well, I suppose I wish that I, rather than being a chiropractor, I wish I was a lawyer, because then maybe I could understand how to participate a bit better. No, look, I really feel like I've tried to convey on behalf of the group what I could.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly, and we appreciate your attendance today, and Ms. McKay's submissions as well. So,
if I review my notes and I feel like I've forgotten anything, might send you an email or something. But yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kelly. Our preference is probably not to. I did talk with Ms. McKay earlier, obviously, about the photos that she said that she might try to share, which I said would need to be done in the next day. So our preference would not be to receive any further additional written material. There's certainly no new content at this stage. Thank you very much for coming along to present to us. We do really appreciate it.
Well, as I said on the first day, I think it's the fact that we're the only, that I can think of, community group being involved, that says a lot, I think. But I really appreciate you listening and taking our submission, and I would hope that you could use us as a resource if you need any further information or any further. Nicole just said before she left that she would be happy to give anyone a tour of the areas if they would like.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelly. Thank you. So that does bring us to the end of our hearing day. Before we do rise for the day, I'll just ask Mr. Townsend if there are any questions or matters that we need to discuss this afternoon.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. And just any other parties, if there are any questions. Okay. So at this stage, we're scheduled to sit tomorrow starting at 10 a.m. and we have a number of other parties presenting, and we're scheduled to finish. It's only a half day sitting, so it's finishing around 1 o'clock tomorrow, just a bit before if we're running to schedule. So look forward to seeing everybody at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you.